06:14 hours. Early autumn. Eastern Front. Outskirts of Polotsk, Belarus. The fog arrived before the guns did, creeping low across the torn ground and settling into the hollows like damp linen pressed against cold skin. It clung to the spruce line and draped itself over the shallow slope that the German infantry had spent 2 days attempting to cross. The earth was black peat mixed with churned clay, turned over by previous bombardment, softened by early morning moisture, and scarred by old shell craters that had long since filled with stagnant water and rotting vegetation. The air carried the acrid scent of burned propellant, layered over pine sap and wet leather. Every breath tasted metallic. Nothing moved quickly here. Movement meant exposure. Exposure meant fire. The assault corridor measured less than 200 meters from the German forward staging trench to the reverse slope where the Soviet position had dug itself into the land. It should have been passable. On maps, it was a thin gray band, sloping gently upward before flattening out at the base of a small berm. But map lines do not account for terrain that kills. From the Soviet perspective, the slope was perfect. The machine gun sat slightly recessed into the earth, angled downward along the corridor's only viable route. Its barrel aligned with clinical intention. A Maxim heavy machine gun dominated the space, its dark silhouette barely visible through the mist, its shield rim slick with condensation. The gun's cadence was precise. Bursts of 5 seconds. Brief corrections of 2. Reload intervals at predictable breathing points in the rhythm. The weapon traversed from left to right in smooth arcs, the barrel sweeping the corridor with mechanical patience. Every pass denied movement. Every pause invited hope and punished it seconds later. The suppression zone extended outward in a controlled fan, a lethal geometry that turned open ground into absence. 2 platoons of Grenadier-Regiment column had already attempted advance through the lane. Both had failed. Within the first minutes of contact, the first line had folded flat into the mud, pinned by intersecting fire that chewed through uniforms and webbing without discrimination. 11 men lay unmoving in the open corridor, their shapes blurred by drifting fog. 3 medics crouched behind a collapsed ditch line, unable to reach them. There was no screaming now, only the dull echo of rounds striking wet earth and the occasional reverberation of shrapnel cutting through fern leaves. A second approach from the left collapsed before it properly began. The ground rose slightly there, a shallow incline that gave the illusion of cover, but every contour had already been measured and accounted for by the gunner on the slope. Any forward motion triggered immediate response. The barrel corrected with ruthless efficiency. The corridor did not forgive. It erased. German doctrine offered little guidance for conditions this precise. Suppressive fire was ineffective. Mortar support could not be brought forward without exposing indirect teams. Artillery had been requested, but could not fire without risking friendly units already pinned in place. The window for high explosive interference did not exist. There were no flanking routes through the spruce line. The surrounding terrain refused maneuver. The enemy position had been built with exact understanding of the landscape. Every approach terminated inside the firing cone. Command pressure began to accumulate behind the line. Radio transmissions from higher officers demanded progress and repositioning. Timetables did not adjust for dead ground. The assault schedule required forward momentum to maintain operational continuity across the sector. Yet the corridor did not respond to urgency. It responded only to steel. Rifle ammunition reserves degraded under ineffectual return fire. Troops expended rounds at shadows where the outline of the berm seemed to shift with mist movement. Each magazine emptied brought no meaningful change to the situation. Grenades were useless at this distance. The far edge of effective throw fell well short of the Soviet emplaced position. The machine gun nest remained unchallenged. It sat where it always had, untouched, unhurried, patient. The problem became static, and static problems, in Army language, are failures dressed in silence. Gefreiter Karl Hensler stood among the second rank, crouched with his boots half submerged in soft earth that clung to his gaiters with stubborn finality. His uniform was unremarkable. His posture suggested neither panic nor authority. He was not issuing commands. He was not calling for medics. He was observing. Hensler's equipment was standard issue. Karabiner rifle slung across his chest, bandoliers tight, one fragmentation grenade clipped at his belt, and, hung at his side, the entrenching spade, folded flat, stamped steel, its edge dulled by weeks of forced digging. The spade was not part of any solution. It was not part of any doctrine. It was an extension of routine survival labor designed for earth, not combat. From his position, Hensler watched the gun's rotation. He studied the interval between bursts. He listened to the subtle pause that accompanied belt adjustments. He noted the slight hesitation when the barrel swept right, how the berm's curvature occluded line of sight for a fraction of time before the traversal returned left. He calculated distance and angle not by measurement, but by repetition. 30 seconds. 40. A rhythm established. This pattern repeated with institutional precision. Time passed inside increments of fire. Every minute stretched taut between survival and expectation. Orders filtered down, but nothing changed. The corridor remained frozen. The gun remained dominant. The state of the field did not evolve. It simply endured. Several soldiers glanced toward Hensler as another burst split across the open ground. He did not return the look. His eyes were forward, toward the slope, toward the silent space beneath the berm where the gun lived. At this stage, nothing about him registered as significant. He was just another figure waiting inside a problem too large for individual resolution. Another component in a stalled formation. Another man surrendering seconds to the forced lull of unmovable geometry. No one marked him as different. No one stopped to consider what he was measuring, what he was counting, or how deeply he was absorbing the mechanics of the enemy's position. The lane did not move. The machine gun remained the fixed point around which everything else failed. And as the fog thickened and the ground drank blood into its blackened grain, the war held its breath around a question no one could yet articulate. How do you break an obstacle that does not react? 0628 hours. The machine gun resumed its measured cycle without variation. The Maxim's burst pattern remained unchanged. 5 seconds sustained. 2 seconds corrective sweep. Belt change at predictable intervals. The Soviet gunner did not accelerate. He did not waste ammunition. He worked the mechanism with trained discipline, maintaining a suppression rhythm that choked the corridor into immobility. Each time the barrel angled fractionally downward, the lane vanished into impact clouds of wet soil and pulverized fern. Karl Hensler shifted his weight slightly, careful not to disturb the low cover surrounding his position. He adjusted the strap of his rifle. He did not raise it. He had already tested sight alignment earlier. He knew his effective range terminated far short of the berm. He knew a rifle would announce his position without altering the result. He remained silent. What he tracked was timing. He observed the assistant gunner rise during reload cycles, feeding belt segments across the receiver with gloved hands that moved from right to left in steady routine. He noticed the slight dip in fire velocity after every third belt. He watched vapor expand from the condenser near the muzzle. Steam vented rhythmically. Pipes hissed. The gunner maintained pace, but the peripheral crew provided micro-delays that the primary operator could not fully compress. This was not weakness. It was pattern. Hensler counted based on cadence, not instinct. 1, 2, 3, burst, pause, correction, reload. His gaze shifted minutely to the left when the barrel traversed wide. He noticed a specific fault line in the slope, a shallow crease where erosion had etched a muted seam through compacted soil. That seam offered fractional relief from direct line of fire, but only during maximum traverse to the right. He tested its value mentally. It could mask him for less than a second. Less than a second was still time. Time existed only between arcs. Behind him, movement remained minimal. The platoon continued to hold under cover, soldiers breathing shallowly in shallow recesses that allowed no forward option. A distant mortar exploded somewhere beyond the tree line, but the sound did not alter the equation. The alley stayed locked. He loosened the fastening clip that held his entrenching spade flat against his belt. It made the faint click of metal release. No one registered the movement. The sound dissolved beneath the percussion of heavy fire. The spade's handle felt cool under wet glove fabric. He folded the joint and pressed the locking pivot inward, securing it to a straight line. He tested its rigidity once, subtle, tactile. Another click. It held. He did not rise. He did not quicken his breath. His eyes returned to the weapon nest. He tracked the traverse again. He waited. The pause arrived. During a reload cycle, when the barrel swept right and visibility toward the left flank narrowed beneath the berm's underside, Hensler advanced. 6 meters forward. Slow. Weighted through the heels, distributing pressure to prevent ground noise. He halted as the next burst tore through air above his former position. Soil erupted behind him. He lowered closer to the earth, 4 meters more. His boots pressed into softened peat with drowned steadiness. He froze as the barrel swept back left. The fog momentarily flashed with tracer fire. A near round struck earth to his right, flinging damp clay across his sleeve. He did not break stride. He moved only when the gun pointed away. Each step conformed to a measured exchange. Motion during blind arc. Stillness during forward sweep. The process repeated across meters that felt endless. Wait. Breathe. Advance. At 40 meters, the angle shifted. He descended slightly into a narrow depression where the ground split from shell impact months earlier. A shallow trench scar. He crouched, counted belt intervals again, then checked lateral threat. A secondary light machine gun flanked from right rear, but its fire was directed further down the corridor. It had not yet realigned. It would. 32 seconds passed in mechanical rhythm. Hensler watched the belt coil slacken. He saw the assistant reach forward again. He adjusted his grip on the spade. The steel edge gleamed faintly where soil moisture traced its shape. Another traverse sweep. Then the window opened. He sprinted. The distance closed fast, 12 meters of open ground compressed into heartbeat count. His boots struck earth with minimal lift. His torso leaned forward. The sound of the Maxim muted partly beneath the berm as his body crossed into its shadow. He reached the base of the slope at 0632 hours. The assistant gunner turned as he rose. The moment was close. Faces now identifiable. Breath visible. The spade came up in one motion and drove forward. The impact sounded dull, organic. The assistant's shoulder buckled. His frame dropped sideways against the receiver housing. A faint cry escaped, more breath than sound. The gunner pivoted, surprised but trained. He reached for the pistol at his belt. Hensler closed before it cleared leather. The spade's edge struck twice more in controlled arcs. First along the jaw hinge, second along the forearm. The locking pin absorbed the shock. The steel flexed, but remained intact. Chaos followed. Two figures surged from the rear slit, but momentum favored the attacker. Hensler stepped over the fallen assistant, drove forward with the flat edge, redirected a bayonet thrust, and forced the line backward into the trench recess. He used the moment of confusion to seize the machine gun's grip frame and yanked its orientation 10 degrees left. He fired. The Maxim barked under new command, its round slicing into the flank of the supporting rifle element at mid-distance. The burst was short, deliberate, just enough to collapse their cohesion. Behind him, German soldiers recognized opportunity. A flare went skyward. Shouts pierced through the fog. The platoon rose. Karl Hensler did not look back. His focus remained forward, holding the nest, holding the angle, ensuring that the gun would not return to its prior rhythm. The lane, once still, began to shift around him. And for the first time since dawn, the corridor moved. 0636 hours. The corridor responded to movement for the first time since dawn. German infantry advanced not in surge but in controlled increments, stepping into ground that had previously been denied. Boots struck earth that moments earlier had been designated fatal. The lane still existed. The slope remained dangerous. But the machine gun no longer spoke with authority. Its voice had been seized. Karl Hensler stood inside the captured position with one knee braced against the berm and the spade lowered in his right hand, its steel edge now darkened with soil and trace matter. The entrenching tool had exceeded its designed purpose. It had not bent. The locking pin had not fractured. The spade had become, through direct necessity, a striking device. He did not dwell on that classification. He checked the angle of the Maxim. He verified the belt alignment. He confirmed that the receiver housing had not warped from prior fire. He cycled the mechanism once. The feed tray responded. The condenser hissed softly. Steam bled through its valve with reduced pressure. The system retained function. He shifted the barrel fractionally leftward and depressed the trigger assembly again. A controlled burst reached outward along the tree line, where Soviet rifle elements attempted to reorient under shock. The impact disrupted their cohesion. A figure staggered. Another collapsed behind low cover. Suppression regained directional dominance. Behind him, boots and hushed commands filled the captured trench. German platoon leaders entered, assessing dimensions, confirming clearance, preparing for follow-on advance. The immediate danger had been neutralized. The corridor, previously paralyzed, now adjusted to new geometry. Time resumed. Hensler released the Maxim and stepped aside, allowing the designated crew to reassert formal control over the weapon. He did not take possession. He did not claim role. He merely retreated a pace and lowered the spade to his side. His breathing remained measured. His expression remained neutral. No visible exertion registered on his face, beyond light mud streaking across his collar and sleeve. The spade had completed its task. He folded it back partially, checking the pivot joint for looseness. The hinge creaked softly, but held. A platoon corporal nodded once in his direction. There were no words. By 0642 hours, the rear supporting trench was secured. The machine gun now served the opposing direction. German forces realigned across the captured slope and began systematic clearance of communication trenches. 2 Soviet soldiers emerged with hands raised. One more surrendered moments later. Their faces were pale, eyes weak, posture resigned. The lane remained quiet. A field officer arrived 30 minutes later, boots crunching through hardened soil as he surveyed the site where 2 men now lay still near the Maxim's original alignment. He studied the gun's position. He traced the angle of approach. He spoke briefly with section leaders. "What neutralized it?" he asked. A brief response. A gesture toward the folded spade resting against Hensler's belt. The officer looked but did not elaborate. The written after-action report recorded the event with professional minimalism. The phrasing was exact. The vocabulary avoided embellishment. It described close-quarters initiative and improvised use of auxiliary equipment. It did not name the spade with reverence. It did not call the act exceptional. It noted deviation. In formal classification, the entrenching tool retained its original definition. Auxiliary, earthworks, sanitation, not suitable for direct assault. Karl Hensler did not challenge that designation. By late morning, the forward elements resumed advancement in accordance with revised schedule. The captured Maxim was disassembled and repositioned. Ammunition stock recalibrated. The corridor now accepted passage. As orders progressed down the line, small notes passed in quiet voice. Soldiers observed how the position had fallen. They wondered at the efficiency of the tool. They did not rehearse. They did not celebrate. In the rear sections, one veteran soldier quietly demonstrated how the spade edge might be angled during narrow space defense. Another nodded and said nothing. Official doctrine remained unchanged. But a detail shifted in practice. Within hours, the spade no longer sat purely as decorative weight. It gained revised presence, not as weapon, as contingency. That night, Karl Hensler cleaned the steel in silence. He scraped clotted earth from the hinge groove and wiped the blade with oilcloth. He checked for micro-fractures. The metal had softened slightly under strain, but retained edge. The handle bore new markings from grip tension. He reattached it to his belt. There was no commendation, ceremony, no recorded speech, no serialized account passed to front-page dispatch. The event remained a line among many. Yet the lane he opened did not close again. Forward operations continued for 3 more days across that sector, before repositioning orders shifted the regiment southward. The captured position hardened into temporary cover. The earth absorbed fresh layers of tread and shell residue. The site faded back into terrain, but the method traveled quietly along trench margins. By late month, observations referenced similar movements by other grenadiers when fixed weapons obstructed narrow passages. The spade, still unnamed as weapon, reappeared in field sketches beside increased proximity measures. No formal addendum followed. No official recognition was printed. The practice lived only in hushed margin instruction. Karl Hensler advanced with his unit until early winter, when reassignment diverted operations further east. His ledger entry remained brief. Position secured under fire. Equipment functioned beyond intended design. A line beneath recorded resupply. He read the note once, then closed the book. The corridor that had refused movement no longer held meaning. It was simply ground crossed, position taken, risk calculated. The spade hung at his side as it always had, silent steel in quiet compliance. And yet, every time he passed another emplaced gun, another trench lip, another moment when geometry forced hesitation, his eyes instinctively measured arc and cadence. His hand rested momentarily on the folded steel, not as pride, not as memory, as readiness. The entrenching spade had been classified as useless. The machine gun nest had been catalogued as unapproachable. Both assumptions had failed. The doctrine books remained intact. The soil did not change. But somewhere between fog and fire, one calculated silence had rewritten the shape of movement. And the lane, once fixed, now held the possibility of passage. 0805 hours. The ridge beyond the captured slope transitioned into broken woodland, where shell-fractured trunks leaned at irregular angles and the ground sloped gently toward a shallow stream bed. German infantry moved forward in staggered intervals, maintaining spacing, aware that momentum did not erase threat. The corridor behind them had fallen silent. But silence on the Eastern Front was never neutral. It was merely delayed sound. Karl Hensler advanced in the second element of his section, maintaining distance consistent with spacing doctrine. His rifle remained slung low. His eyes swept left and right without urgency. His pace did not exceed that of the men around him. No gesture marked his previous actions. No alteration in bearing indicated distinction. He remained a grenadier among grenadiers. The terrain ahead presented new geometry. A shallow defile opened between two low embankments, its floor compacted by rain and worn vegetation. The left side rose slightly, offering minimal elevation. The right dipped toward the stream bed, now choked with moss and debris. Visibility extended no more than 30 meters forward through tangled brush and intermittent fog lift. A burst of automatic fire erupted without warning. A light machine gun, positioned at the edge of the embankment, swept the defile in short, precise motions. Fire origin: frontal right elevation, angle, downward sweep. Suppression radius: narrow but effective. The lead element pressed into cover immediately, bodies flattening against mud and exposed root systems. The firing pattern stabilized into contained bursts. Rapid, controlled, measured. Communication crackled behind the line, orders transmitted to hold position. Preliminary analysis suggested an entrenched position reinforced by overlapping fire arcs. Secondary support unknown. Attempted probe halted within seconds. Hensler crouched beside a collapsed root and observed again. He did not turn toward command. He did not speak. His gaze settled on the gun's movement through foliage breaks. He studied the moment where the barrel rose slightly, then dipped during reorientation. He identified the margin where brush momentarily obscured the line. The position was not as fortified as the earlier nest, but it occupied the same psychological space: obstacle, control, delay. He checked the strap of his spade unconsciously. The entrenching tool remained officially unaltered in purpose. The classification had not changed. It remained a utility object. Yet it had demonstrated physical reliability under non-design conditions. The body retained memory, even as documentation denied relevance. He shifted one pace forward during a lull, then another during a reload sound. No one noticed. The gunner recentered his sweep, a round clipped bark above Hensler's shoulder, sending fragments down across his helmet. He continued. A corporal nearby whispered a warning and gestured for him to remain. Hensler nodded without reply. He did not accelerate. He measured. The spade was no longer symbolic. It was contingency. He moved along a shallow contour line where undergrowth thinned slightly. The machine gun traversed away briefly to engage movement further left. That created a fractional blind arc. He crossed through it. 2 meters, then 3, then pause. He dropped lower and crawled the remainder, hands pressing into wet leaves, boots sliding minimally. The terrain offered no concealment beyond shadow depth and barrel rotation. When he rose again, he was within 8 meters of the firing position. The gunner, unaware of his approach, remained focused downrange. The assistant handed another belt segment across, eyes fixed forward. Neither registered lateral proximity. Both operated inside habitual repetition. The spade came forward in controlled arc. The first strike hit the junction under the helmet rim. The second followed without pause. The assistant attempted to pivot and raise a forearm, but the moment closed. The position collapsed inward under silence and precision. The machine gun sputtered once, then fell quiet. Hensler did not take the weapon. He stepped over it and turned it slightly sideways, denying immediate reuse. He signaled with hand motion. The section moved forward. There was no noise beyond muted motion. The defile accepted passage. Boots touched earth that had been fixed moments prior. The delay dissolved. A sergeant glanced at the fallen position and at Hensler. He did not speak. By 0820 hours, the unit reformed inside temporary cover beyond the embankment. The corridor replacement moved accordingly. Momentum stabilized. The line shifted another 70 meters east before halting again under mortar reach. In formal accounting, the incident did not receive separate entry. It merged into the composite metric of engagement progression under hostile resistance. The spade again functioned beyond its designated classification. The tool remained unnamed in reports. It remained invisible in doctrine. But context expanded. Within shared silence between men, small adjustments occurred. The spade was no longer viewed solely as excavation extension. It carried latent potential. It suggested necessity not listed by manual. It became something adjacent to readiness. Hensler did not instruct. He did not advocate. He did not demonstrate. His behavior suggested nothing more than situational compliance. But observation, among others, circulated quietly. Later that evening, within a makeshift shelter formed by overlapping canvas and corrugated metal, a young grenadier tested the edge of his own spade against a stone with exploratory motion. Another watched and did not comment. The sound of grinding steel bled into evening wind. No official order legitimized the act. The decision emerged from terrain and circumstance. The adaptation existed only where geometry demanded it. Karl Hensler sat alone, cleaning the hinge mechanism once again. He wiped moisture from both sides of the blade. He adjusted the locking screw. The metal bore faint deformation from cumulative impact, but its integrity held. He returned it to his belt. No mention of the second engagement entered any ledger. The act belonged solely to the narrow seconds between suppression and silence. The tool responded. The situation resolved. The march east resumed at dawn, and as frozen breath rose into soft gray air and the ground hardened again beneath winter's first suggestion, the spade moved with the man, not as weapon, not as symbol, but as unspoken margin of capability. Where doctrine faltered, steel remained. Where words failed, trajectory endured. And the ground, once closed, opened again. 0940 hours. A light frost had begun forming along exposed vegetation as the temperature slid downward. The morning haze thinned gradually, revealing the uneven ridgeline beyond the defile. The unit advanced another measured distance and halted in terrain that offered limited concealment but strategic angle over the next fold of earth. Command shifted priorities, consolidation, observation, reorganization. Karl Hensler remained in position behind a low rise, helmet rim shadowing his fixed gaze. His posture was unchanged, rifle resting across his thigh, spade affixed at his side. Nothing about his bearing suggested sequence or pattern. Yet the linear advance had altered. The corridor now carried memory of interruption. The men knew it. Across the line, new roles formed without instruction. Grenadiers began spacing themselves with attention toward lateral blind angles. Those closest to forward positions adjusted their stance instinctively, measuring silence rather than sound. No directive spoke of the spade. But two men were seen repositioning theirs. The second platoon, anchored 12 meters to the north, had paused while scouting elements examined the stream crossing under dim canopy. A junior soldier crouched to the rear and ran cloth over his entrenching blade. He did it slowly, methodically, not to clean but to sharpen. Another soldier observed, nodded once, and returned to his own position. No words were exchanged. The practice remained unofficial. It existed in recognition without ritual. At 10:20 hours, a probe emerged from the brush ahead. 4 Soviet infantry running low across the stream bed attempted to reach the forward trench before German elements re-established fire. A scattered volley met them mid-slope. One fell. A second rolled aside. The others retreated quickly into foliage. Silence resumed. During the pause, supply runners arrived with belt segments and ration sacks. The regiment resumed internal function. Boots shifted, equipment checked. Hensler seated himself and ate without haste. His attention remained forward. Even during rest, his eyes moved in narrow patterns. He calculated intervals unconsciously. He evaluated geometry where no combat yet resumed. The mind did not disengage. It reported. By midday, temperatures stabilized. Fog lifted entirely. Visibility extended further into broken ground. The natural flow of sight shifted, and with it, the potential for misalignment. Further ahead, the outline of a suppressed emplacement became visible. Not active, not yet occupied, but capable. A future point of influence, a silent obstacle. Hensler observed its contours without motion. He made no move toward it. He remained waiting. 12:05 hours. The sound of distant artillery began to echo, not immediate, but approaching. Shell impact distances registered as directional shifts, not direct threat. The battalion commander corrected formation again, drawing elements into calculated positions to compensate. A young grenadier approached Hensler and settled near his cover. "You moved fast earlier," he said quietly. Hensler nodded without answering. The soldier glanced once toward the spade at his belt, then back toward the forward line. "It held?" the soldier asked. Hensler looked down at the tool briefly. "It held," he said. The exchange ended. The quiet resumed. By early afternoon, the unit regained coherence. The line moved again, not through resistance, but through absence. The land ahead continued to shape behavior. Small ridgelines offered momentary cessation from line-of-sight vulnerability. The men advanced with measured progression, their equilibrium secured by absence of force. But absence was temporary. 13:30 hours. Gunfire resumed unexpectedly from left flank approach. A Soviet forward patrol had identified the movement and established a shallow intercept. Rounds struck bark and soil irregularly. The sound pattern suggested small arms, not automatic, not sustained. Return fire eliminated the threat within minutes, but the reaction had been instant. Spades were drawn by 3 men, not to dig, to guard approach. They held them reverse grip along forearm, watching the undergrowth just as rifles were pressed forward. The motion was subtle, the intent unmistakable. Command did not intervene. The practice did not escalate. When quiet returned again, the incorporation receded back into unseen habit. Karl Hensler remained unchanged. He moved only when motion was required. He did not instruct. He did not mythologize. His silence carried no directive. Yet his prior action continued shaping minor deviations around him. The spade, as an instrument of groundwork, became one of proximity defense, not defined, not debated, only used. At dusk, the regiment halted near a low ridge just beyond the engagement zone. Night perimeter established, rotation scheduled, equipment checked. Hensler sat against a fragment of stone and adjusted the latch on the spade hinge again. The hinge had softened slightly under sustained impact and friction. He tightened the screw with precision and ran cloth across the flat steel. There was no sign of ritual, only maintenance. In the distance, faint movement flickered through brush. The men remained still. Night settled. The stars above were obscured by thin haze and drifting cloud. The air held damp chill and muted echoes of distant movement. No orders changed. No citation arrived. The spade remained unclassified. But within the quiet span between action and anticipation, the knowledge persisted. That the field extended beyond doctrine. That utility lived beyond designation. And that silence, properly timed, could become decisive force. When Karl Hensler closed his eyes that evening, the memory he retained was not violence. It was geometry. And the lesson held without speech. Never assume a tool is useless until it is the only one left. The night breathed quietly across ground shaped by men and machines, by silence and steel. And the spade, folded and secured at his side, waited for another moment that might never require it again. But if it did, it would respond. Not as weapon, as function. 0440 hours. The night had passed without incident. No probing, no tracer arcs. No, the final distance collapsed into controlled silence. The assistant saw him only as shadow before metal struck. Impact, twice. Then the gunner turned. Too late. The suppression line ended. The men surged forward. This time, the action lasted seconds, not minutes. The pattern was almost rehearsed, but it was not. It was learned. No one called out his name. No command officer instructed the movement. It occurred because the body responded faster than policy. The spade returned to his side again. The path opened. By 0600 hours, the regiment held the corridor entirely. No further contact occurred on that section. The formation held steady. The men paused. Supplies rebalanced. Hensler stood near shallow berm edge and wiped soil from the locking hinge of the spade with a fragment of cloth. The tools showed measurable wear, slight bend, minor distortion, still usable. He returned it again. A lieutenant approached cautiously and studied the collapsed gun emplacement. He examined the positioning and the approach angle, then looked once toward Hensler. "You again?" Hensler nodded. The lieutenant hesitated briefly. "You train this?" "No," Hensler said. The lieutenant looked down at the spade. "You should." Hensler did not answer. The lieutenant moved away. Later in the afternoon, 2 grenadiers quietly asked him to show the angle of approach he had used. He complied without explanation. Without ceremony, he demonstrated trajectory once, then stepped back. No speech followed. That evening, within the command tent, brief mention occurred regarding increased survivability in close-range trench interaction. The commanding officer referred to auxiliary field tools employed for proximity resolution. It was noted, not endorsed, not rejected. The word contingency appeared, no doctrine revised. But by dark, 4 men had angled their spade edges and secured their belts tighter. The formation slept in shifts. Karl Hensler slept briefly. He did not dream of violence. He saw only interrupted terrain lines and timing fragments. Rhythm without sound, space without language. Morning returned again. The war continued without deviation. And the spade, no longer thought of as useless by those who had seen it move, now traveled with quiet significance through every forward motion made after that day. It remained unnamed. It remained undocumented. But each time suppression fire painted the corridor red with kinetic barrier, eyes shifted instinctively toward folded steel and unspoken geometry. The nest would not reopen. The lane would not close. And the ground, silent and indifferent, accepted once again the passage of men who had learned that function is not assigned by manual. It is proven by need. 0640 hours. Gray light filtered through the upper branches and settled in uneven patches across churned ground. The frost that had hardened the soil overnight now softened into moisture under slow warming air. Steam rose faintly from damp uniforms. Breath moved in pale arcs. The forward line remained intact. Karl Hensler stood at the perimeter of the temporary hold position and observed the terrain ahead. No movement registered. No new sound interrupted the forest's ambient silence. Yet the sensation of expectation did not lift. It stabilized. The corridor extended another 60 meters before dipping into broken ground. Beyond that, a scatter of fallen trunks and shallow excavation suggested prior engagement by units long since displaced. The entire geometry favored ambush once again. He did not move. He waited. Behind him, men performed routine checks, ammunition redistribution, barrel cooling, water rationing. The sounds were low, minimal, efficient. Each motion returned the unit incrementally to baseline readiness. The spade remained at his side. Its edge dulled slightly now, not by wear of soil, but by repeated impact under conditions it was never manufactured for. Its steel surface recorded fine nicks and shallow grooves that spoke not of trenches, but of bone contact and deflection. He observed that, without commentary. At 0720, command shifted instructions. A flanking reconnaissance was required to verify a presence along the collapsed northern route where contact had not yet been confirmed. A 4-man element was assigned. Karl Hensler was not among them. He remained forward. Minutes passed. The sound of movement returned without warning as fire traced through the left edge of the corridor. Controlled, moderate, directional. Another intercept. The reconnaissance element pulled back under light cover. The threat remained intermittent. The line adjusted. Hensler crouched again. He measured distance to the impact source. 15 meters, possibly less. He visualized the possible firing origin based on angle shift and tracer pattern. He identified the break point in vegetation where mimicry of cover concealed shallow recess. This time, no one spoke of initiative. The other soldiers did not move. Hensler did. He advanced in shallow arc, using irregular terrain and dead foliage as fractional shielding. The path he chose was not direct. It curved along slope where muzzle arc could not cleanly isolate his movement. Every step was deliberate. The gun resumed speech. He did not retreat. He closed. This time he did not sprint. He walked with low profile, allowing each movement to blend with visual disruption of fog and slope distortion. When the traverse pulsed outward, he stepped laterally. When it swept inward, he froze. The spade came free before the position even registered his presence. The assistant tried to rotate the gun slightly. The first strike halted that intention. The second reversed it. The gun fell silent. No flare issued this time. No shout followed. The corridor's tension dissolved without signal. When the platoon advanced, they found Hensler already standing aside from the collapsed position, replacing the spade to folded state and checking the locking joint as before. This had become sequence. This had become margin. A margin not described in orders. A solution born purely of spatial understanding. No medal accompanied the maneuver. No citation captured it. The ledger later would record only incremental forward progression. One more notch in a borderless war. But among those who saw it, the effect was permanent. The spade now represented an unspoken alteration in their understanding of equipment capability. The division between designed function and necessary function thinned every time geometry failed. He did not encourage imitation, but it followed. At 0910, another soldier approached a shallow trench line and instead of retreating or firing, raised his own entrenching spade and advanced under partial muzzle distortion. The gunner flinched. The burst shortened. That soldier withdrew, but the hesitation created opportunity. Doctrine did not phrase that action, but it validated Hensler's silence. By midday, the pattern was repeated twice more by separate men under similar conditions. No communication preceded it. No formal acknowledgement followed. But together, the unit passed through ground that previously held zero margin for crossing. Karl Hensler stood under a low broken fir tree watching the advance. He saw no heroism in what had occurred, only inevitability where options had evaporated. He did not consider the spade a weapon, nor did he consider its denial of that label a flaw. He accepted it as instrument. He accepted that circumstance redefined objects faster than engineering could. In the evening, a senior officer visited the line and reviewed engagement flow. He asked questions regarding casualties and movement resistance. His tone remained official, dispassionate. He paused when term entrenching tool appeared more than once in informal descriptions given by junior ranks. "What is this about?" he asked. A lieutenant gave partial explanation. Not theatrical, factual, nuanced. The officer frowned slightly. "That is not its purpose?" "No," the lieutenant said. "But it worked." The officer nodded once, then resumed his review without comment. Nothing changed. The spade remained auxiliary, and yet the landscape ahead now recognized that it no longer controlled passage entirely through mechanical dominance. The power of imposed stillness had weakened. Karl Hensler ate his ration and drank from his canteen as night settled over shattered forest. He cleaned the spade hinge again. He aligned its blade with simple care, not pride, not reverence, only maintenance. He checked his rifle. He did not look behind him. He observed only forward, because somewhere ahead, another lane would attempt to become fixed. Another machine gun nest would declare control. Another position would deny motion. And the space between doctrine and survival would be tested again. When that moment came, he knew what he would reach for. Not a concept, not a command, but a piece of steel that chose compliance when everything else chose failure. Early evening. The temperature dropped incrementally as the light withdrew behind the line of blackened trees. Moisture condensed into a thin veil along the forest floor. Uniform cloth stiffened. Sound traveled more clearly. Every mechanical adjustment became audible. The position secured earlier in the day no longer echoed with distant fire. Instead, it absorbed the muted sounds of consolidation. Boots compressing damp soil, metal against metal, whispered corrections, low-voiced confirmation of spacing and arcs. Karl Hensler moved only when necessary. He did not take center. He did not seek position. He waited on the edge of the perimeter, observing the direction the corridor extended. His breathing remained slow, his posture unchanged. The spade rested against his left thigh, folded, silent. A messenger arrived with brief directive from battalion. Advance adjustments were to resume under limited light. The opposing slope showed signs of renewed occupation further north. Another firing point had been detected beyond the previous neutralized zone. Field intelligence suspected rotation of personnel and replacement emplacement. Same pattern, different location. The battalion command did not request method. They demanded result. The movement began at civil twilight, partial visibility, low contrast. The corridor narrowed as it extended. Vegetation became uneven. The slope ahead rose with slight camber, its crest broken by collapsed fencing and debris from older engagements. No direct flash was visible yet, but the silence carried tension that betrayed readiness. At approximately 50 meters, the first burst opened. Compact, severe. Short-lived, measured. Suppression re-entered the equation. Men froze by instinct. The sound altered depth perception. Directional concealment returned. The line halted. Again. Karl Hensler watched the arc. He identified the origin by rhythmic shift in fire density. The weapon was mounted lower this time, slightly recessed, possibly trained by new hands attempting procedural mimicry without intimate terrain knowledge. He did not communicate. He moved. The terrain differed. Less slope, more broken root exposure. Thistle stalks and bark breakage offered partial scaffold for gradual approach. This time, he advanced in staggered halves, allowing the enemy sweep to dictate pause duration. His timing aligned to recoil intervals. He observed not the weapon, but the gaps between its focus. Half movement, stillness, half again. The spade disengaged without sound. He crossed the final length under momentary obscuration. The assistant looked up too late. The blow landed with precision comparable to prior engagement. The operator attempted reversal. The third motion interrupted the function of his grasp. The gun slid off alignment and collapsed into its anchor. Smoke diffused. Silence resumed. There was no immediate counter. But this time, reinforcement voices approached from the rear trench channel. Their tone differed. Alerted, agitated, responsive. Hensler did not retreat. He stepped to the gun. He turned it 1 degree. He fired without overextension. Controlled interval. Disruption only. Then he withdrew, not retreating but repositioning to the left flank of the nest. When the platoon advanced, they found no defenders in position. Only the displaced machine gun, its mechanism cooled and inert, and the shallow trace of boot impressions disappearing laterally into brush. They did not speak of it. They marked the ground. They passed through. Night continued to close. Stars appeared behind partial cloud cover. Karl Hensler resumed a position near the rear of the forward element. He did not eat immediately. He observed. The action had repeated so often, it no longer registered as outlier. It entered the rhythm of adjustment, quiet, efficient, functional. What had begun as anomaly became expectation, not voiced, but mentally assigned. In the absence of alternative vectors, men began to gauge their movement by his behavior. Subconsciously, peripheral awareness. When he moved forward, tension adjusted. When he paused, restraint followed. He did not lead. He absorbed a moment and redirected it. Night deepened. At perimeter examination, the lieutenant inspected the neutralized nest. He studied the irregular marks left by spade contact. He tagged the location discreetly for reference. No notation of commendation followed. No additional observation entered official ledger. Only functionality. The spade, still unrecognized officially, maintained its defined category. Yet its concurrent usage statistics increased. A map table illumination flickered briefly between blackout cloth edges. Pencil marks adjusted the grid. Progress lines redrew visibility. The corridor, once held rigid, now expanded along a new axis. A path. An anomaly column intersecting standard doctrine lines. Karl Hensler leaned briefly against the trunk of a tree and allowed his eyes to close for seconds only. He exhaled. He felt the weight of damp uniform, the stiffness of earth grime, the slight ache running across his shoulder blades. His hands remained steady. He adjusted the weapon strap. He adjusted the spade hinge. He did not think about tomorrow. He thought only about angle, depth, cover variance, the precise moment between burst and correction, because that interval had become the only predictable element in the geometry of suppression. When dawn returned, another emplacement would emerge unseen. Another attempt to still the corridor, another predictive line drawn by heavy steel and repetition. But the ground now contained precedent, a proof that even the most rigid mechanism contained an entry point, not through force, but through calibration, through refusal to acknowledge assumed limits. Karl Hensler stood as the night grew colder and the forest returned to silence. The corridor exhaled. It yielded. Not because it wished to, but because one man had redefined the space between intended design and unintended use, and walked through it without asking permission.